The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, the rise, fall, and resurgence of progressive movements in California and the lessons for our entire nation. And Bill Press with The Guardian's Lauren Gambino covering the Mueller investigation and the ever-growing field of Democratic presidential candidates. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight, and follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Decades ago, California experienced the political and social shifts that now grip the nation. In his newest book, sociologist Manuel Pastor tells the story of how California fought back and offers a compelling and hopeful vision for a necessary political renewal that meets the needs of a more diverse America. And we say hello to Dr. Manuel Pastor, a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California. He currently directs the Program for Environmental and Regional Equity at USC and USC's Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. His most recent book is State of Resistance: What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Mean for America's Future. Dr. Manuel Pastor, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Glad to be with you.
And nice to have you with us. Your book has been described as a story in 3 acts: rise, fall, and recovery. Before we get to the present day, let's go over some of the history. You describe the 1950s and 1960s in California as, quote, precisely the sort of demonstration project for an active government that many conservatives seem to fear at a national level, close quote. What was happening in California at that time?
Well, the 50s and the 60s in California were a bit of a golden era. Not perfectly so, because there certainly was persistent racial discrimination in housing and labor markets, but there was a sense of optimism of the state sort of moving ahead. It was a state that was investing in infrastructure, water and roads at that time. Of course, currently now we need to invest in climate infrastructure. It was a state that was expanding the housing market, mostly through suburbia, but it was building housing for people who were coming to the state. Most importantly, it was investing in human capital. In the 60s, California was in the top 10 of states in the United States in terms of its spending on K-12 education per capita. And it had come up with something called the Master Plan, which articulated the relationship of community colleges, state colleges, which were mostly doing teaching, and the university system. So major investments in human capital. All of that was held together with an economy that was growing jobs in the middle. So many people who were working class could become middle class in terms of their lifestyles. And it was part of a sort of social compact, fairly bipartisan at that time, about the need to welcome newcomers and invest in the next generation. It was a very active government presence in terms of its interventions, and it was an economy that was growing. Interestingly, there's echoes of that today as well. California has the 5th largest economy in the world. It's aggressively pursuing addressing climate change. It attracts 50% of the nation's venture capital. It should, given its aggressive pursuit of climate change and tough environmental regulations and, progressive taxes and everything, according to conservatives, the state should not work. But in fact, the state is humming along economically.
Mm-hmm. But back then, as all of this was happening, then came the resistance. So how did conservatives fight back, and what parallels do you see in today's politics?
Well, I think the really important thing to think about in the California story is just as more people, particularly more diverse folks, wanted to become part of that California social compact, there was a reaction. So, for example, in the 1970s, is the decade in California's history in which the share of children who are children of color grew by more than at any other time in California's history before or since, actually. And as the state began to change demographically, in some ways, race and racism got the better of Californians. By the end of the 1970s, we had passed Proposition 13, which was a sort of anti-government, low-tax measure that really set off a wave of tax cutting, not only in California, but throughout the nation. And in fact, it's a proposition that Ronald Reagan used to sort of write his way to the presidency in 1980, along on a slogan of shrinking the government and cutting taxes. That was happening, shrinking the public sector, just as a new generation was arriving that needed public investments that had made an earlier generation so successful. So we still needed investments in infrastructure. We still needed investments in housing. We still needed investments in human capital. But the state was being fiscally starved, and Proposition 13, because it was a property tax reassessment, made it less possible to build housing. So that was then coupled in the 1990s with an era that Daniel Ho Sang, political scientist at Yale, calls the decade of racial propositions. That's when California voters passed Proposition 187, which is the proposition that sought to strip social services, including educational services, away from undocumented immigrants. We got rid of affirmative action and bilingual education, and we passed three strikes laws and expanded the incarceration system at a sort of reckless rate. That was happening just as the state was going through big demographic changes. And in many ways, California was America fast forward. If you think about the United States right now, in some ways the U.S. is going through its Prop 187 moment. That is a sort of freak out around immigrants and demographic change. But what people forget about California in the early 1990s is that we were also a state that in the early 1990s suffered half of the country's net job losses because the recession of the early 1990s was about the cutback in defense spending with the end of the Cold War, the way that sort of kicked out the props from under the aerospace industry and the way that rippled through the industrial structure, particularly in California. And people also forget that Rush Limbaugh began his bombastic talk radio career in Sacramento in the late 1980s. So that kind of combination of demographic anxiety, economic uncertainty, and profiteering from political polarization that conservatives are trying to do right now nationwide, take advantage of nationwide with the vehicle of Trump, is exactly what California went through in the 1990s. It's been a tremendous arc of change since, which we can talk about, but it's important to realize that California's, right at the time in which California should have been focusing on the economic restructuring that needed to take place in the early 1990s and mid-1990s to have an economy that would work once again for the middle. Instead, we were driven to fear the immigrant, blame the other. It's exactly what's going on nationwide right now.
Just amazing when you look at history and realize that it's nastily repeating itself somehow. Is it accurate to say that in taking such an aggressive stance to progressive change in California, the conservatives sowed their own seeds of decline?
Well, it's remarkable that, people forget that California is the state that gave you Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. It's the state that gave you a series of tax revolts that rippled across the country in the late 1970s and through the 1980s. It's the state that gave you restrictive immigration laws. Los Angeles was a city once known as the wicked city because of its anti-union and pro-private sector stance. So, we really were a very red state. Now we've become a very blue state. So, what happened? I mean, I think that, aside from what progressives did, which we can talk a little bit more about too, I think conservatives, really dug themselves into a hole. They thought just like the Republican Party thinks today, that if they could appeal to and animate a shrinking white, older electorate, that would be enough to be able to hold on to power. But demographic change kept taking place. People began to realize that they needed to, on the progressive side, shift the message and become more effective at their own politics. And today in California, there are, three things you can put when you state your party preference: Democrat, Republican, or no party preference. Of those three, Republicans are number 3. That is, Democrats are number 1 in terms of registration, no party preference is number 2, Republicans are number 3. And there's not a single statewide office held by a Republican, and there are supermajorities above 2/3 in both the House, or our state assembly, and our state senate. We've become a remarkably blue state. Orange County in the last election, every single congressional seat went to a Democrat after being held, so many of them, by Republicans. So I think, it's interesting because I do think that there are ways in which conservatives and Republicans could have an appeal to the changing demography of the country. And certainly there's always been an ideological tug of war between those who favor markets, those who favor more government intervention, those who think about sort of conservative social values, those who are embodying the future of family and community. But basically conservatives and Republicans sort of dug their own electoral grave in California, and in many ways we see them doing the same thing at a nationwide scale right now.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Dr. Manuel Pastor, Distinguished Professor of Sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. His latest book, State of Resistance: What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Mean for America's Future. Manuel, California, as you just pointed out, is now at a very different place, leading the way on a range of issues from climate change, criminal justice, immigrant rights. One thing your book does so well is describe how that happened. This was the work of many people, many organizations. To begin with, what has been the role of grassroots organizers in California politics?
Well, it's been very deep and profound, the role of grassroots organizers and social movements in California politics. And it's important to understand that in the early 1990s, after so many of these very negative propositions targeting communities of color, there was a reaction on the part of progressives that the idea of standing apart from elections and being a little bit purist about our politics was no longer going to work. And there's many different changes that happened, but I'll just focus in on 3 that I think are really critical and actually have nationwide rippling effects currently. The first was the evolution of something called integrated voter engagement. Usually when people think about sort of voter mobilization, it's get out the vote, GOTV, which means that you go out at the last minute, you figure out people who normally vote with you, and you make sure that they go ahead and vote in an election of consequence. What organizers realized was that they needed to change the electorate. And in order to change the electorate, you had to meet people and stay engaged with them between elections, and you have to target new and occasional voters, not the people that you would target with a GOTV to come out at the last minute because they're voters, you just need to animate them, but people who had never voted before. So basically, community organizing meant electoral politics. It meant talking to people between elections and then using the sort of legitimate civic activity of an election to convince somebody that they also ought to go to a march or to a city council meeting, et cetera. And currently, there's a number of groups in California, but one of the leading ones is California Calls, and they're able, along with a bunch of other groups, to mobilize about 750,000 voters in any election. It's about probably 1 million. It will be 1 million by 2020. And these are new and occasional voters, and that's enough to swing almost any proposition in the state of California. And that's why we've been able to raise our taxes on millionaires. It's why we've been able to begin to reduce the criminal justice, the size of the incarceration system, et cetera. So integrated voter engagement. The second thing was beginning to realize rhetorically that the task was not to move to the middle, to sort of compromise, but to try to move the middle, that is to try to change the politics to move in a more progressive direction. So you see people launching things like the living wage campaign, because who could be opposed to a living wage? It sort of changes the electorate, it sort of changes the rhetoric and moves things in the direction of increasing the minimum wage. Or the dreamers, who begin to talk about the rights of immigrants who came to this country undocumented when young but grew up here and are embracing the American dream. They're not talking about a sort of compromise, a move to the middle with regard to immigration policy, but how do you actually move the middle and sort of change the electorate to move in your direction? The third big thing in California was begin to realize something very fundamental. The way I joke about it is there's not one more liberal that you're going to get out of Berkeley. If there's a conservative person living in Berkeley, that person is determined and resistant to every social norm around them. But what you need to do is to begin to organize in unlikely places geographically. That is what's called the Inland Empire, Riverside and San Bernardino County, San Diego, Orange County, and the Central Valley, places that have traditionally been red or purple. And it is of note, as I mentioned before, that in this last election, Orange County went 100% blue in terms of its congressional seats. In 2016, it voted for Hillary Clinton. Was the first time Orange County had voted for a Democratic candidate since Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. If you think about those three lessons, sort of change the electorate, move the middle, and then run everywhere, that's essentially what Beto O'Rourke just did in Texas and came up within a couple of points of winning, which was a remarkable achievement for Texas. It's what Stacey Abrams did in Georgia. She tried to change that electorate. She ran everywhere. She held firm to her beliefs. That's what Andrew Gillum, too. Each of them did in Florida. Each of them came up short, but in fact, Stacey Abrams probably won if there hadn't been so much vote rigging going on. But what we know then is that this is a strategy that kind of developed in California. It really has demonstrated the possibility to elect progressives into power, including the president pro tem of the Senate, Kevin De Leon, who's the person who's pushed a lot of the climate change legislation. He's now stepped down, terming out, and also he's the person who passed what's called the California Values Act, which is the declaration of California as a sanctuary city. Think about it being called the California Values Act. How remarkable. He was a grassroots organizer who cut his teeth organizing against Prop 187 and then moved into electoral politics. So I think this kind of combination of making sure that we integrate community organizing, electoral politics, making sure that we sort of try to use a rhetoric that moves the middle. It doesn't mean that we don't, that we're so strident nobody comes with us, but that we're firm in our moral beliefs and that we reach out to geographies we've never reached out to. I think that's a very important recipe for the rest of the country.
We want you to sit back and listen to this AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We're talking with Manuel Pastor about how California turned into a state of resistance. We'll have more in just a moment, but first we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
How thrilling was tax day for you? I refer, of course, to the thrill of getting that big, juicy reduction in your taxes, thanks to the $1.5 trillion tax cut that Donald Trump and the Republicans passed. Remember? They promised it would deliver a 7-course dinner for everyone. Middle-class Americans should be grateful to the GOP, said Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, because, quote, you have more money in your pocket. Actually, Mitch, no. While the richest 1/10 of 1% of taxpayers wallowed in more than $100,000 each from your skewed giveaway, the great majority of us have now learned that our 7-course dinner is a possum and a six-pack, at most. Indeed, an April poll by the Wall Street Journal reveals that only 17% of Americans can detect that they got any tax cut at all. In fact, the Republican tax bill was a cynical bait-and-switch job from the start. They did make a small, highly publicized cut in the middle class's tax rate, but hocus pocus, they quietly disappeared that benefit by eliminating or reducing various tax deductions that those families had been entitled to. Also, by cutting about $1 trillion from the tax payments owed by the richest corporations and people, they clearly were going to nuclearize the federal deficit. So, to overcome that political hurdle, they resorted to the horriest rhetorical trick of demagogic political scoundrels, the big lie, which Trump and company repeated loudly and constantly. The giveaway intoned a smirking McConnell to the media will not gut government revenues, but will be a, quote, revenue producer. Of course, it was not, instead skyrocketing our country's deficit, which is now projected to surpass $1 trillion next year. This is Jim Hightower saying that wasn't a thrill that people felt on tax day. It was a financial chill.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We're talking with Manuel Pastor, Distinguished Professor of Sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California, and author of State of Resistance, What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Mean for America's Future. We want to pick this up talking about labor unions. How effective have labor unions been in effecting progressive change in California?
Well, labor unions have been a very key part of the story, and in part because in California, unions really began to shift to being what's called the social movement union model, so that rather than simply organizing for the interests of the workers that they cover, unions have been very crucial to living wage campaigns, to raising the minimum wage. We're one of the first 2 states to go to $15 an hour. These are things that do not directly benefit union members, but they do change the terrain of labor markets in a way that can benefit labor unions. The other thing I think that's been remarkable, and again, it's kind of a lesson for the rest of the country, was to begin to realize that immigrants were not necessarily competitors to union workers, but in fact were highly organizable. Immigrants tend to come from countries where there's much more of a tradition of social movement mobilization. They're very open to collective action, and I think that one of the things that was surprising for unions was that a lot of immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, were quite open to being mobilized by unions. One of the sort of secrets of electoral change in California, for example, was the Los Angeles County Fed, the sort of federation of unions here, beginning to realize that they could actually change politics by having undocumented immigrant union members who couldn't vote and nonetheless be those who would walk precincts and try to mobilize others to vote. So labor unions have been a very important part of change in California, but these are not sort of old-style labor unions. They've really become much more social movement labor unions.
Mm-hmm. Now, changes in the way politics is done. Let's talk about the importance there, such as term limits and citizen-driven redistricting.
Well, I think term limits turned out to be important. The knock against term limits is that people are always looking over their shoulder and they may not develop expertise in the particular political position that they hold at that moment because they're thinking about what the next one might be so that they could run into their next set of term limits in their next job. But the nice thing about term limits was that it sort of opened up the path for people who would go from activist politics to quite quickly rise to leadership positions. So Karen Bass, who was a community organizer in South Los Angeles, ran for the assembly, and within a couple of short years was Speaker of the Assembly, the first African-American female to be head of a state assembly anywhere in the United States. And Kevin De Leon, who I mentioned earlier, who'd been a community organizer, became quite quickly president pro tem, that is the leader of the state Senate, and able to preside over a lot of change. So term limits turned out to be an important thing, particularly to bring in a new crop of more activist folks, more folks of color to move to top positions. The citizen-driven redistricting took the redistricting out of the hands of political figures. There's a lot of resistance to that, of course. But when you think about the way, for example, the Republicans were able to gerrymander so many states in the United States after the Tea Party wave in 2010, citizen-driven redistricting really could have prevented that from happening. And it really, in California, has made a huge difference because the districts are drawn in such a way that citizen preferences are more easily revealed. And it turns out this is a very democratic and progressive state, and so it's been a little bit easier to sort of lock up those majorities in the state assembly and state senate.
We're speaking with Dr. Manuel Pastor, Distinguished Professor of Sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. Manuel, we know that California is a bellwether state in terms of demographics. What can the rest of the nation learn from California about how to build a multi-ethnic democracy?
Well, it is true that California is a bellwether state. The demographic change in California between 1980 and 2000, in which we went from being about 67-69% non-Hispanic white to being a majority people of color state, is basically the demographic change that the United States is going through between 2000 and 2050. That's the reason why the first chapter of the book is called America Fast Forward. I think what the rest of the nation can learn about this demographic change from California is that the change itself is pretty bumpy. I mean, the 80s and the 90s were periods of remarkable interethnic tension and really kind of white anxiety and white fragility, sense of a state being lost on the part in California. And yet at the end of this process, we've got a state where they're, working together with one another is remarkably valued, and where this has become kind of the way in which people simply do business and do life and understand that this is the way democracy takes place. There's still big challenges that the state needs to address in terms of we're backing off from incarceration, but we've got a legacy of people who've been incarcerated. How do we make sure that they're able to integrate into labor markets and back into communities? We certainly have a very different approach in terms of immigration. There's much less fear of it and much more of a recognition of the contributions that immigrants bring, the community safety and security that takes place when you have a lot of immigrants in your community, and of course the huge gains in cuisine that take place when you've got, a big immigrant presence. I mean, what other state has something like Korean barbecue tacos? I mean, how much better does it get? So I do think that there's a lot to learn from California. But the big thing, I think, is how do we speed these processes up? How do we recognize that what's going on in the rest of the country is really a set of growing pains and that we need to kind of get through them very quickly? I mean, one thing that's really remarkable to me, and I think it really will illustrate this point, when you think about the places in the United States that seem to be the most fearful about immigrants, they generally don't have a lot of immigrants. Those of us who have a lot of immigrants, California, New York, Florida, are places that are much more open about making sure that immigrants, regardless of status, have a role in our democracy, our society, and our economy. Sometimes it strikes me as odd that the places that have the least immigrants both have such a high level of anxiety and then have such a lock on what national immigration policy would be like. It seems like those of us who've experienced what this is like and what its benefits are should be able to have more influence on that, on what the nation does.
I can only assume that their ignorance is bliss, or something along those lines.
I think their ignorance is actually just ignorance, but go.
Well, right. Better put. There are lessons, of course, for Republicans and Democrats alike in your book. Starting off with Republicans, what's your warning to Republicans?
Well, I was asked the other day when speaking in California by a Republican, don't I think that it's unhealthy that California has become essentially a one-party state, overwhelmingly Democrat. And I said, first, it's not quite that because there's splits within the Democratic Party between what are thought of as moderate or business Democrats and more progressive Democrats. Of course, that's reflected at a national level as well. But also, it's not quite my job to figure out how your party becomes more popular. So, I think the warning to Republicans from California is that you could really lock yourself out electorally for generations to come. Because if you look at the attitudes around race and racism, around immigrants, around LGBTQ rights, around whether or not the government should provide support so that people can get through the market turmoil that exists, that is, should government have a bigger role. And you look at that not just by race, but by age. If you move from an older electorate to a younger electorate, you move to an electorate that is much more open to immigration, much more wants to see things done about racism, is much more concerned about addressing climate change, is much more open and less fearful of the term socialism and much more open to the government kind of intervention in the economy. And just as in California, where Republicans seem to have locked themselves into a permanent minority by alienating the demographics that were on the rise, it seems like that's something that Republicans are doing nationwide as well. So that's the warning. If you want to be able to be relevant, don't do that, because there really are, potential, as I mentioned, inroads for Republicans with this rising demographic. Young people generally value creativity and autonomy. A lot of that squares with markets. Many of our immigrant communities, for example, Latino and Asian immigrant communities, do have some conservative social values, which I think Republicans could appeal to. But fortunately for my side, Republicans seem to have been completely inept at doing that.
Mm-hmm. And as for Democrats, what words of caution and direction can you offer from this California story?
Just taking office is not enough, and just being a Democrat is not enough. One of the things I think that's happened in California, and I think I see it happening nationwide, particularly in reaction to the Trump presidency, is a rise in grassroots organizing, grassroots education, people learning about political issues, and really wanting people to move in a direction that's going to be more fundamental at addressing our issues and our problems. So it's no surprise to me that the Democratic candidates for the president right now have all been forced to move left. That's not just the kind of traditional activists of the of the Democratic Party. It's that the new people who have been mobilized in a sort of anti-Trump era have begun to recognize that, if Trump is actually trying to completely shipwreck our healthcare system, maybe we need to move in a more profound direction so that it's less vulnerable to that, and certainly moving to Medicare for all would do exactly that kind of a thing. Maybe if we see someone who's trying to demonize immigrants, it makes it very clear that we have an immigration system that's broken and that we need to move in a direction that provides full citizenship to the undocumented immigrants who are here and which tries to figure out how to regularize flows in an orderly way in the future. And maybe if we've got a president who's basically doubling down on tax cuts for the wealthy, corporations, and for a market-driven economy, maybe we need to move in a different direction. I think Trump has marginalized sort of those ideas so much amongst a large section of the electorate that's really an opportunity for grassroots organizers to get out there, talk to people, really move things over in a sort of more left or progressive direction. My warning to Democrats, I think for the most part people are dealing with this well. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is not a one-off. She's not if she hadn't popped up in the Bronx, she would have popped up someplace else. If the Parkland kids had not popped up after the Parkland shooting, they would have popped up someplace else. If Black Lives Matter had not risen after the Ferguson, it would have risen someplace else. If the Dreamers had not come together to challenge President Obama, they would have come together someplace else. There's something out there that's longing for a more progressive party, that's longing for a sharper moral vision, that's longing for a society to really come together and make change. The warning to Democrats is to not think that it's politics as usual, but to understand that this is really a fundamental change. It's an opportunity, but it means that simply doing the same old politics and putting the same old politicians in place probably is not going to work. And it's going to be a difficult balancing act for the next 5 years to decade.
The name of his latest book, State of Resistance, What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Mean for America's Future. Dr. Manuel Pastor joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Manuel, we thank you as always for your time and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Pleasure being with you.
Thank you very much. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with The Guardian's Lauren Gambino on an upcoming Biden announcement and how it will change the 2020 race.
Great to see everybody. Lauren Gambino joins us from The Guardian, who's been covering 2020 and reaction to the Mueller Report as well. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Good to see you. And Peter Obgren here with us to check in on comments over the last half hour.
As you can imagine, we have a lot of comments
on
the Mueller Report.
So.
Yeah. Let's start out with Holly. Holly, our good friend, says that if Democrats do not hold up the rule of law and do their constitutional duty by impeaching Donald Trump, why should any Democrats vote for them in 2020? There are people who really want to see impeachment hearings now because of the Mueller Report. KG says, so it isn't obstruction if you don't succeed at it? Is that the new...
That's what Bill Barr says.
Basically.
Yeah, right. Which is total BS. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Somebody else points out trying to obstruct justice is obstruction. Just because you're incompetent doesn't give you a pass on that.
Totally. And I mean, the idea that, other people didn't carry out his orders, so therefore he's not guilty of obstructing justice. Yes, he is.
Yeah. And Tom pointed out, because we talked about Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who was caught in a lie. He says one action that the White House press corps can take right now strongly suggests that Sarah Huckabee Sanders resign.
I'd like to see the White House press corps make that.
You're a member of the White House press corps.
I am. I'm not on the board. But, right. We have a dinner coming up next Saturday.
Oh, that's right. Is that happening?
Maybe That could be a resolution introduced at the dinner.
Let's see. Let's see.
Take your vote. Show of hands.
Yeah, right. If you have any comments on any topic at any time, of course, we're always on Twitter at BP Show.
All right, don't run away because
I'm not going anywhere.
One reaction that we had yesterday to the Mueller Report, not unexpected, was that Kellyanne Conway,
of course,
runs out to talk to Fox News, and then she just says, "Oh, happy days are here again."
His greatest rebuttal will be he's in office, he's going to remain in office, and he'll get reelected because the Democrats have nothing. They banked everything on this.
Yeah. That's not exactly the same point of view, Lauren, is it, that husband George Conway expresses in this morning's Washington Post?
Yes, he writes in his op-ed that Trump is a cancer and that he's clearly not fit for the presidency. So, what goes on there, we will never know.
I know,
or understand.
Yeah. So George Conway, husband of Kellyanne, said that, quoting John Dean, there's a cancer on the presidency, and we have to excise it. Yes.
He goes pretty far on this stuff.
He does.
That's the thing, right? Like,
Almost
it's not like
for the Democrats.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this isn't like a Carville Madeline thing.
No,
you know what I mean?
Where
they like are kind of polite when they get in that same space. It's pretty devastating.
It is. And the other thing is, he's not like James Carville and Mary Madeline. They're both political pros, right?
Yeah.
But political consultants. George Conway is an attorney.
Yeah.
He's a good attorney. He's an attorney, actually, that Donald Trump has used to get him out of several jams, right?
Right.
And he says, no, the law is clear. Donald Trump has broken the law, and he's got to be. Anyhow, that's just one other dimension of this whole thing. And, Lauren, you've been covering 2020 and the news this morning. What do we know, Peter, about Joe Biden? It's just that the sources now say he's definitely made up his mind, as if he hadn't already.
So this was a story in The Atlantic this morning by Edward Isaac Dovier. The headline makes it pretty clear.
Good reporter.
Joe Biden is running for president. The former vice president has finally decided that he is in, and he is announcing in less than a week. He's just finishing putting the campaign together. They say that a video announcement is going to come on Wednesday of next week. That is according to people familiar with the discussion, and they have been told by top aides. So he has actually made the decision. There is no more back and forth. He's running. He's running, and he's going to make it official on Wednesday of next week.
And, Lauren, all the polls so far show Joe Biden, even as a non-candidate, leading the Democratic primary.
Right, and the assumption has been that it's his name recognition, that's what's sort of keeping him up there in the polls, and so now it'll be a real test. Is it name recognition? Have other people made gains? I think it will really show pretty quickly whether he is the leader of the pack. And, I think Bernie Sanders' campaign thinks that, it's only going to go down from him once he gets into the race. That's what they're anticipating and hoping, Bernie Sanders being sort of second. And the leader of the people who have declared, I guess. Definitely still trailing Biden in several early polls. So I guess we'll see, what his candidacy looks like and whether he can get past these sort of...
Is his pitch that even if he doesn't make it, say it directly, is his indirect pitch at least, I'm the third term of Barack Obama? I mean, I will continue the Barack Obama kind of presidency, that kind of a Democrat, which is not exactly a Bernie Sanders Democrat,
no,
by any means, but solid, centrist, left-of-center Democrat.
I think it would be interpreted that way, even if he doesn't make that case, and certainly because he would be running as a counterweight to Bernie Sanders. I mean, that's not the entire reason why he'd run, but, stepping in now, given that they're both leading in the polls and given his political views, I think he would be seen as as sort of the counterbalance, the candidate that a lot of centrists could rally around if they don't want to see Bernie Sanders come away with a nomination. That could very much look like a third term for Barack Obama, though we saw Hillary Clinton to some degree run as a third term.
That was her pitch, basically, right?
Yeah.
If I could read for a little bit from this piece, it says Biden's campaign will, as at its core, argue that the response to Donald Trump requires an experienced, calm hand to help America take a deep breath and figure out a way to get back on track. First, however, there is the primary, of course, which you have to deal with the Democrats. But that's going to be his pitch in the general is, I know what I'm doing. I've been at this for a long time. I can fix the problems that have been done in the first term of Donald Trump.
All right. So we just heard about this, right? We knew it was sort of coming, but now it's official. It seems to me, my first reaction is that this primary could break down one of two ways. One is it really becomes a contest between Bernie and Joe Biden. And are you going to take, again, that pitch Peter just read from the Atlantic thing? This is the calm, steady hand, experienced that we need against Donald Trump. We can't take this chance of getting somebody as progressive or as far left as Bernie Sanders. So you gotta, that all the rest of them kind of fade away, and it really is a contest between the two front runners, and two different approaches to two different wings of the Democratic Party, if you will. That's one way. The other way could be that the other candidates just say, "Look, these two old farts. We don't need any one of these two old farts, right? We need somebody younger." More diversity, person of color or a woman, younger, to really take the party in a new direction. So I think it could go, either way. Obviously, I think the other 18 candidates are going to be making that argument. But no, you don't have to choose between Joe and Bernie. You got a lot of new choices over here, like me, I don't know. I don't know how it goes. Joe Biden, it should be pointed out, if he does win, he will be 77 years old when he takes over the presidency.
And Sanders would be the same age.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So I mean,
which would be the oldest ever.
They would be the oldest ever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They would be the oldest ever.
I think
Bernie would, for the record, Bernie would actually be 78
right,
if he was to win the first term.
So but you must say
they're old guys.
If 70 is the new 60 or whatever, both of them are in good shape.
Absolutely.
Right.
Mentally and physically.
Absolutely.
Right. It might not be so much about their exact age, but sort of just what they represent and the sort of era of politics. Though I guess Bernie does, it's not like you've had a president like Bernie before, so that he can still make the case that he's the outsider and has these new ideas that he would bring forward. But I do think it kind of benefits those two if it becomes a contest between, the left and the center. Mm-hmm. You could see Joe Biden really consolidating the field around sort of an anti-Bernie sentiment, and then vice versa. Bernie could obviously rally his support against an establishment. You could see him really playing, doing almost in a way what Donald Trump did, which is
right. And I know several big Democratic donors have told me that they were waiting to see what Joe Biden did. I mean,
right,
right.
You can't discount that.
Right. What kind of reaction did we see, or is it too early, to the Mueller report yesterday from the 2020 candidates?
You saw them, you didn't see anyone call for impeachment. I think that's important. The only person who called for the impeachment, you had Eric Swalwell call for the resignation of William Barr.
I was surprised that more people didn't do that after Barr's performance yesterday.
Right. I mean, there's certainly...
Kirsten Gillibrand, as I saw, she was out in Iowa, said, I'm not sure we could impeach him, but that he certainly is acting like Donald Trump's personal attorney, not the Attorney General for the American people. But I think Congress could impeach a cabinet member. Pretty sure, right? I mean...
Yeah, I believe the Constitution allows
it.
Right. So then, the question then becomes, what to what end? Who would replace William Barr? They almost went through this, before they voted on his confirmation not that long ago, and who Trump might, replace him with.
Yeah, that's an important point. It wasn't that long ago that they confirmed Bill Barr, and I'm sure some of those. I forget whether I know he got a couple of. He got a couple of Democratic votes, didn't he?
He did.
Yeah.
The 2020 candidates, I'm pretty sure, maybe with the exception of Amy Klobuchar, voted against him, but I would have to check that.
Yeah. So we talked about Joe Biden getting in and Bernie being the other front runner. Bernie had a good moment on Fox News this week. I think he proved those who said Democrats should never appear on Fox News. He kind of proved them wrong.
Right. I mean, he's making a general election pitch at this point. He thinks he can win Trump or vote people who voted for Trump. He thinks that's a constituency that he can win that others can't. And so he took his message to Fox News. I think he surprised a lot of people. He had that call and response with the crowd. He got, the audience cheering for his policies. He got them to say they'd be willing to transfer from, employer health insurance to a Medicare for all type system. So I think he felt really good leaving the stage after that Fox event. And now you see other candidates starting to announce their own town hall events with Fox.
Right.
So maybe he sort of set the precedent there.
Amy Klobuchar on May 8. We saw that Pete Buttigieg and Julian Castro are in final negotiations with Fox, and some others. I mentioned Amy. Some of the others are also starting to see if they can line one up as well, right?
Exactly.
But of the candidates who are in, and Joe Biden still is not in, and we can't really say he is until we see the video. Of the candidates who are in, Bernie is clearly at this point the front runner.
Yeah, that became very clear after, I think, his fundraising figures, and then, all this polling has put him at the top. And then, after the Fox town hall, he really showed, I think, that he's ready to be the front runner. And then again, we saw this week some reporting around efforts to try to stop Bernie. So there's clearly a recognition that he does have these advantages, and that if he's, if there's not an alternative found pretty quickly, he could go very far in this nomination.
Right. And among the other, just one more on Bernie, and he does have this base, right? I mean, this base that he built up in 2016 that he has stayed in touch with. They haven't gone away. They're loyal to him, and he's adding to his base all the time. I mean, every figure we've seen on the fundraising, there are not just the old Bernie bros, but new people coming in with small dollar donations, people that he can go back to again and again and again. He raised $236 million last time on small dollar donations, period. Right. And
it's a huge
he'll surpass that this time.
And and because I think from the first quarter we saw, there's plenty of Democrats still deciding whether to give and who to give to. So to have that head start, it puts him just, leaps and bounds above the rest of the field, especially you've got candidates who are still, having to introduce themselves to the public. They've got to spend money telling their story. Bernie doesn't have to do that. He's able to just sort of go out, and what we're really seeing is him making a general election case already. He's sort of, I think they've decided that his biggest vulnerability is convincing people he's electable against Donald Trump. And so he started to make that case. And he can pretty much grab the attention. He's got that base and, an email list that he can just blast out. So he's been able to, sort of when the attention shifts to maybe Mueller or other stories, he just continues to travel the country and make his case.
And meanwhile, whatever happened to Beto O'Rourke? He sort of disappeared from cable television. In fact, people are starting to ask him about that. Wow, you used to be everywhere, right? I mean, I remember the day he announced where cable television carried him live in that in a coffee house in Iowa, right? It was insane.
It was wall-to-wall coverage for days.
Right, right. And suddenly...
Well, I think part of that Mayor Pete's had a moment. He's sort of taken that spotlight, and he's sort of emerged as this fresh face with a great biography and compelling story. Mayor Pete's very good, it seems like, at making news. And I think I do think those two actually could draw from each other. I think Beto was sort of losing out both in media attention and possibly supporters from Pete. And so I guess we'll see how far Pete can go. Obviously, Beto has incredible fundraising numbers so far, so he could probably, he'll be in for a while.
But the kind of campaign that we've seen from Beto O'Rourke is the one that did so well for him in Texas, but it's a very unstructured campaign. He didn't take any polls, right? He had skeletal staff, right, in Texas, and he now does running for president, and he sort of it seems to me his entire campaign is built around doing as many personal appearances as he can in a day, driving himself to most of them in his pickup truck. I mean, can you really sustain a presidential campaign with those few, that approach or those few resources?
Right. I mean, that's
I think not.
the bet. Yeah, it's a risk. The people I've talked to, though, have said, he's got a lot of good people on his team. And they say not to write him off yet, basically, that he's got smart people around him and, to expect things to get more formalized as the race heats up, ahead of the Democratic debates, and, just expect to see more from him.
The other rap on him is no substance, or little substance. I should say not no substance, because he's smart and he knows a lot about the issues, and he's good on the front. I've seen most of the issues: climate change, criminal justice reform, prison reform. He's good on those issues, but he's not known as like Elizabeth Warren is,
like a policy heavyweight,
as a policy wonk or policy heavyweight, right?
Well, I've seen that maybe work both ways, because I think because that's the narrative around him. When I went out with him, people were, sort of pleasantly surprised by how much he does know and how much he does actually talk about policy. And so I think that has sort of worked to his benefit. And then the other piece of it is, his supporters will argue, like, Hillary Clinton had, policy white papers, taller than me, but ultimately that's not what the voters wanted to hear, and that's not what they wanted to talk about. They wanted a vision and an aspirational message, and he has that. So they argue, he does have it. If you go to his website and you press him on the issues, he's got it. It's just that's not what he's leading with.
But as you pointed out, if anyone has taken away from Beto, it seems to be Mayor Pete, who is certainly having a moment. How long that moment lasts, we'll see. There are those who say Julian Castro is the next one to get his moment. But for now, I saw this morning, coming from California, that I was interested to see that Mayor Pete has this next weekend a fundraising, I think it's the middle of next week maybe, a fundraising swing through California with major events scheduled in San Diego, several in Los Angeles, and about 5 or 7 different fundraising events in the San Francisco Bay Area. I mean, this is Kamala Harris territory. And the fact that he could go into California and with the potential of raising a lot of money, that's significant.
Absolutely. And it probably
What's the appeal of Mayor Pete? Just the fact that he's young, gay, smart?
Right. I mean, his biography is compelling, and that obviously attracts media attention. He's different. He's someone new, not known on, most people don't know him, or they're just learning about him. But I think, that he
and
is
can't
so
pronounce
young.
his name.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think it all works to his benefit, and he gets to sort of
he's very, I'm very high on him. He's very good on his feet. He really knows the issues.
I think everyone's really impressed when they hear from him, because he does respond in sort of he's very articulate, obviously, but he also sort of is interesting in his responses. We saw him, go pretty far on the idea of court packing, which is surprising because he's been written off or, described as maybe a more moderate or more of a centrist. So I think he just offers sort of a different take on a lot of issues or at least the way he describes it and the way he responds is something that I think a lot of Democrats have found compelling.
Right. Of the others, right?
Yes.
Some of them just a mere blip. Some of them maybe a little more than that. We've just talked about the men so far. Which of the women do you think can break through?
I mean, yeah, it's almost been, a sad joke that, there are so many women running for president. Why aren't they getting any attention? I think, I still think Kamala Harris is incredibly strong. She has a good campaign. And if it's right that South Carolina is sort of the linchpin of any sort of strategy to winning the nomination, I think she has a really good shot at that. She has a good team on the ground there, and she's just done a lot of work in the state. And, obviously then she would go into California and likely have a strong showing. I think, it's hard to say because Warren is just not, she might be sort of providing policies that the candidates can later adopt, but she doesn't seem to be having that moment. And I think a lot of us are wondering what it would take for her to really take off. Gillibrand is, not is sort of registering as a blip, though, also has a very serious campaign. Amy Klobuchar, interestingly, is the one I think a lot of Republicans worry about. Trump supporting Republicans, because she has Midwestern appeal, being from Minnesota. They can't label her as, far left socialist. She's been very sort of upfront about, what she would and wouldn't do. She doesn't support Medicare for all. She doesn't support some of these progressive litmus tests. So I think she could have a moment, especially maybe if Biden stumbled. I think maybe you'd see a lot of people in the party reach for her. I'm trying to think, who else do we have? Who else have I missed? There's so many.
I don't know whether you talked about Elizabeth Warren, but she's up there pretty strong already, right?
Yeah, right. Name recognition is, decent compared to the rest of the field.
And the one who's put out the most serious policy issues is all. And let us remind ourselves every time we talk about this, in terms of who's got a moment and who doesn't, and who may be ahead right now. It is awfully early. It is so early. We're only in April 2019, and we're more than 6 months away from even the first caucuses in Iowa. So people who may not have emerged yet have lots of time to do so between now and then, right?
And the debates will change everything.
And the first debate, in June, right? In June, in Miami. Lauren Gambino from The Guardian, theguardian.com/US, I guess, right? theguardian.com.
It'll direct you.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible, Manuel Pastor and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.